welcome to my backyard. Back in 2007, a small film was released. It was an Israeli-US-French co-production, and it caused quite a sensation, winning many awards around the world. The film was called The Band's Visit, and it starred Sasson Gabay. Now, if you know the TV series Shtisel, he plays the crazy uncle from Belgium, Nachum. Great character and great series. So then somebody had the idea to turn this quiet little story into a musical. And in 2018, it won 10 Tony Awards and a Grammy. And then last year, 2019, it hit the road for its first national tour and visited about 15 cities and was headed to the Dolby Theater in LA, and a whole bunch of people from Valley Beth Shalom were going to go. And then the coronavirus happened. And so that explains why we get to visit with two members of this remarkable cast today. The band in The Band's Visit is an Egyptian police band that gets invited to an Arab cultural center in the south of Israel, and they get lost. They wind up in this small town with a bunch of local Israelis, and it's very interesting to see what happens. So one of these amazing musician actors in the show, his name is Ronnie Malley, and he is an amazing, fantastic oud player, percussionist, and was really the inspiration for much of the music in The Band's Visit. And so we're very lucky to have him with us today. So without further ado, I'll let Ronnie introduce himself to you, tell you a little bit about his really interesting background, and play some of his amazing music. Hello, Ronnie.
Hi, Phil. How are you? Thank you for having me.
Great. So pleased and honored to have you with us today.
Thank you. I'll give you a little piece here.
what a great way to start our conversation. I have so many questions about that piece. First of all, wonderful, exciting piece of music. Seems like it's telling a story.
I've always thought that this was definitely a standard of the classical Middle Eastern repertoire. Um, the composer is actually Egyptian, but this is a piece that it's one of those icebreaker pieces when you meet musicians from the region. Almost everybody knows this. This is such a standard. It's like playing Take Five.
What's the name of it?
So the name is Sama'i Bayati. Sama'i is a form. It's a classical form of Middle Eastern classical music. And Bayati is actually the maqam. It's the music theory system of the Middle East, which we'll probably get into later once we start talking about like, music from the sacred and secular traditions of the Middle East, including Jewish piyutim or Byzantine chants, etc.
So does this fall in the category of religious or secular?
No, it's a very secular, like classical piece, very on par with what you might consider, Western classical music. In many ways, this style of music predates what we consider to be the classical music of Bach on through Stravinsky. And this is actually a music theory system that was contributed to by many people of the Middle East, from Iraq all the way to Andalusia. And so there are religious pieces, piyutim, written in maqam. There are Byzantine chants written in maqam, Islamic anashid written in maqam, music theory. So it's multi-faith.
I always wonder, because it is, what drives the music? Is it the culture that drives the music? Or is it the music that the religious tradition that drives the music? Culture, religion, it's all so intertwined, isn't it?
It really is. Sometimes it's really both more often, especially when we get to the Middle East, where all of our idioms and our sayings and our proverbs and everything relate to the divine. I mean, take the word inshallah in Arabic, which means God willing. And it could mean, of course, God willing. Or it can mean, yeah, maybe I'll get to that. Or, yeah, I don't think I'm going to get to that. So I'm just saying, if God wills it, maybe it'll happen.
Fantastic. People in our community are somewhat familiar with Middle Eastern music. And we've had a wonderful musician in residence the last 3 years, Asher Levy, who plays the oud also and is passionate about this music. So when they hear this music, they'll say, oh, that's Fardic, or that's Mizrahi, which are, Jewish forms of the same thing. And it's always amazes me when I hear things that you would say probably from the Arabic tradition, and yet sound so Jewish to me.
Not so different from each other, particularly when we're talking about, up until the 1950s in Iraq, for example, which was a very vibrant musical scene, very cosmopolitan. There were Iraqi Jews, Christians, and Muslims, and a great deal of them were musicians who worked together. Sometimes they would even play for each other's services. Sometimes they were just a group. Religion wasn't the divider, so to speak, of a class. If you played music, then yes, let's play music together. It kind of superseded whatever label one would ascribe to themselves.
Right. Can you play something for us that kind of shows different influences?
Indeed. For example, this is one of the most famous songs of the Middle East. It's a very famous folk song, and it's called Fog al-Nakhl, which could mean two things depending on how you say it. Of course, these Semitic languages are interesting. So Fog al-Nakhl could mean above the date tree or above we have a friend. So I personally prefer the latter because many Iraqis actually look at it as that as well. And, this is a song that loosely translated, above I have a friend. And is that the gleam of the moon, or is it the gleam in the cheek, in her or his cheek? So the light that they see.
It's kind of like Song of Songs. It has those multiple meanings.
Exactly. So this is a song that's in a maqam called Hejaz, which you'll recognize because it's also of the Jewish traditions.
Good. We'll talk about that after.
فوق النخل فوق يابا فوق النخل فوق مدري لمع خدك يابا مدري القمر فوق والله ما اريد باليني بلوى الله يا مجرى المية سلم عليهم عليهم صعبان الفرقة علي اشتقنا إليهم إليهم والله ما أريد باليني بلوى
Beautiful. Yeah, and it reminds me of a Ladino tune, Los Bibilicos, you're probably familiar with.
Yes.
And of course, that scale, as you pointed out, Hijaz and the Phrygish, we call it, but it's the Phrygian mode. And if I say die, 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 it sounds very Jewish. And of course, you play it on the oud, it sounds, Middle Eastern generally, So.
Yeah, I mean, like you just pointed out, that was one of the reasons I think a lot of Sephardic music and even like the Mizrahi piyutim really resonated with me. I not only saw it as part of the Jewish tradition, I saw it as part of the Semitic tradition in general.
Yeah.
There's so much sharing going on. I mean, you heard that song, and like you just pointed out,
that's it. That's the one. Right.
So it's the same thing almost, really. It's amazing how all of these things are so connected.
It truly is. I want to, because we're going to have Marc Ginsburg joining us shortly from the show, and I've been wanting to ask you so many questions about the band's visit. But before we get to that, I want to talk about the work that you're doing in Chicago. And you mentioned some amazing projects that you've been working on, musicals, cultural events, and so forth. And I wanted to give you a chance to tell our audience about that.
I appreciate that. Many years ago, I stumbled upon a mantra that I created for myself, and I said, I want to tell the untold stories. There were a lot of things happening. For example, with the war in Gaza, with the political things that were going on, and all of a sudden, just because I was Palestinian, I'm sure as you might be Jewish, people will come up to you and start asking you so many questions. But the thing that truly bothered me, to be honest with you, was the presumption that some people had coming up to me to exert their own anti-Semitism, assuming that I don't like Jews. And I thought to myself, whoa, slow down. Don't ascribe that to me. If people have issues with political parties, that's one thing. But for me to say that would just be inviting anybody to say, I don't like Muslims or I don't like Christians. Persecution, there's no monopoly on it. And so that question really prompted me to want to discover how can I respond to this, but in a way that's not just on Facebook or anything else. And so one of the stories that really came to mind was the story of Ziryab, the gentleman who took the oud to Cordoba, Spain. And the more I started to learn about Spain and understand Andalusia and medieval Spain especially, there just emerged such a rich history, the whole concept of convivencia, coexistence. And I thought to myself, well, coexistence of what? And lo and behold, it's coexistence of the three Abrahamic faiths, talking about Islam, Eastern Christianity, as well as Judaism. And boy, once I found that, I was like, okay, this is going to be kind of a framing device. And I put together a play called Ziryab, the Songbird of Andalusia. And I wrote it only from basically almost like a biopic perspective of this person's life. But when I presented it to the producers, they said, well, can you put more of your life in it as well? I don't like talking about myself personally, you know, but I took the opportunity to then remember all the stories my grandmother told me about growing up in the West Jerusalem neighborhood of Romema in the early 20th century. And up until 48, basically.
Yeah, what was that like? That's amazing facts about you.
You dropped that on me. That was like the golden nugget for me in some ways, where, you know, it dispelled quickly the notion of what I kept hearing, of people saying, those people have been fighting for thousands of years. I know you've heard that. I know I've heard that. I need to dispel that notion because that's not entirely true. All of Andalusia, the golden era of it, for nearly 700 years, people spoke Ladino, Arabic, Castilian Spanish, and the cultures created one culture, very much like America. And what she described to me was not unlike that. The buildings that we owned in West Jerusalem, which are still there, were occupied by Jewish, Christian, and Muslim residents. And I think I mentioned this too. Indeed, the rabbi that lived across the hall from my great-grandparents, his children used to call my great-grandfather Baba. To show you the communal aspect, that sentence in itself, that scene for me just summated everything, where it told me right then and there that what she said to me once was, people were more concerned with being good neighbors than they were with being good Jews, Christians, or Muslims.
Right, right. And at the end of the day, that's the people, you know, that's what's happening. You know, I've been in the West Bank and I've been in a grocery store and it's Israelis and Palestinians and everybody's just kind of trying to live their life and they're getting along just fine. You know, it's other people who sometimes create the problems. So I'll use your word, inshallah, God willing, one day we can live like they did in Andalusia.
Or so, even Jerusalem.
Yeah, or even Jerusalem. A little tougher. So I wonder if you could do one more piece for us, and then I'd like to welcome our other guests. And so, you know, I started out by telling the folks at home about the band's visit, and I have so many questions I want to ask about that too. So can you play something for us that will kind of give us a bridge to welcoming Marc Ginsburg and talking about the show?
You know, I will. I'm going to play actually an original song.
Oh,
piece.
Good.
And the reason I'm playing that right now is this. There exists out there somewhere a recording of the musicians from the band's visit playing it. This was actually a piece that I brought to the group. We, for the band's visit, you know, every theatrical production I work with, it's always usually some, you know, amazing, top-notch musicians on these productions. And I think to myself, what a shame we can't limit our playing together just to this show. We need to have another outlet. And let me just say, the musicians that were on this production, on this tour, became like family. And it was indeed that, us playing together, that really just developed a chemistry like no other. So much so that we even dubbed our names The Visitors. And we started to do gigs outside of the show. It helped promote the show, but it also really gave us an outlet to play. But more so, it gave us an opportunity to write new music for this instrumentation.
Oh, fantastic. I can't wait to hear it. I just want to let the folks at home know that the show is going to be here at some point, hopefully around this time next year, perhaps. They're not being official about it. And at that time, I am inviting the visitors to come to Valley Beth Shalom, and we'll invite, you know, all the great musicians that play this music from around Los Angeles, and there are many. And we'll have an unforgettable night of music.
Thank you. It would be such a pleasure, really, really. This piece is called Zahma, which means crowded.
It's just an amazing piece. And I always wonder, when a brilliant musician writes something like that, do you expect anyone in the world to be able to play it? Because, wow, I was imagining it, on staff paper. And I don't think many could play it. So before Marc joins us, I just want to ask, how did you get involved with the band's Visit?
That's a funny story. So back in 2009 to 2010, I was on a theatrical production tour of Arabian Nights by the director Mary Zimmerman. And while I was on that tour, talk about another cast of people from everywhere. There were people from the Middle East, from Israel, from Pakistan, from Iran, all on this cast of people. And one of my friends was from Iran, went back to New York, and gave me a call literally the next day after we finished our tour and said, "Hey, can you be in New York tomorrow?"
Oh,
I just got home, man. Said, there's this thing, it's a reading for this play, and I think they could really use your help with some of the music and some of the language. He's like, you've got to just come and do this. It's right up your alley. I said, well, what's it called? He said, it's called The Band's Visit. By coincidence, just 2 months before that, I happened to watch the movie. And I said, hey, I that movie. That's great. Okay, let's see what it's going to turn into. And so I flew out to New York that day, and we did the reading. I consulted on the music, I consulted on some of the language, and we performed the reading for the producers, and to try to get it produced, so to speak. And this was in 2010.
And had the music been written, the songs? No.
We were kind of developing some stuff there in the workshop at that time.
So was David Yazbek involved in the show at that time?
So we were just kind of, it wasn't even meant to be a musical.
Well, you know, and when I first heard it was made into a musical, I thought, really? How does that little film become a musical? And it's actually quite wonderful.
You know, it's funny too, you say that, because that was one of the things. Like 2 years later, after we had done this, I got a call back from the producers. I happened to be at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival doing a production out there. And they said, we'd like to have you involved on this, you know, as in music direction of sorts. I said, well, I've got a contract here for a year, so I can't go anywhere, but I'll be happy to help you. And so I offered consultation sessions, and I sent them a big list of, well, the first thing, you know, they said, what are your thoughts on this? I said, well, my thoughts about the movie and the idea of this play is that it's about an Egyptian band, and there's so little music in it that that offers an opportunity. Now, the first thing that runs through your mind, though, is like, well, how the heck are you going to get, you know, an Egyptian band to be part of this play? This is such a niche kind of instrumentation, understanding, particularly without, you know, appropriation in many ways, too. What ended up, the result of all this, I feel, is great, because all along the way, the producers really did want to give credit and legitimacy to the cultures that are represented here, which is very important when you're doing these kind of works. And so from there on, I sent them a whole list of all these Egyptian songs I grew up listening to. I have my familiarity with the music. And I said, guys, you should turn it into something like with music. And they came back and said, why don't we make it a musical?
Wow. What a great story. So you're responsible for this.
I can't take full credit. You know, it wasn't like musicals are this new invention. But, you know, I'm just fortunate and grateful to have had any hand in any of the product itself. And fast forward, you know, to 2018, 6-7 years later, my friends who I actually performed with in Arabian Nights, who are also in the production as well, Jonathan Raviv being one of them, and just to see what happened with it, the success it had, particularly even like David Cromer directing it, the Chicago connection of it. Mm-hmm. I felt very proud. I felt almost like an uncle to the show.
Yeah, well, that's fantastic.
Loop around, and the music directors sent me a couple of emails asking if I could actually be part of the first run before Broadway.
And act in it as well.
Act in it as well. I couldn't do that at that particular time. I was already booked, and I couldn't like be with them on that part. Mm-hmm. But then when they decided to do it as an North American tour, I got the call, and the music supervisor was like, even if you can't do it, please send us people who can.
Well, you know, you have all these connections with the show. I have a connection with the show, too. And he's a young man named Marc Ginsburg. Full disclosure, he happens to be my son-in-law. And he is in the national tour of the band's Visit. He's a wonderful performer. You may have seen him in Ragtime last year, for which he got an Ovation nomination. He has several Ovation nominations. He's really a terrific actor, incredible singer. I wish he'd be a Cantor, but he's got other plans. Anyhow, I'm going to ask Marc to join us right now.
Fantastic.
Greetings, Marc. You look a lot like Tevye today.
Thankfully, I don't feel a lot like Tevye. I'm not pulling a cart or anything like that, so all is well.
So I want to ask the two of you, what's it like traveling, you know, with a merry band of actors and musicians and doing 8 shows a week for months at a time? What happens during that time, Marc?
What happens during that time? It depends on the week, really, because our schedule has been such that sometimes we sit down in a place for 5 weeks. Sometimes we're in a place for 2 weeks. Then there's the 1 weekers. So all of those issues kind of make things interesting, but it's fantastic. It's so much fun because you're always in a new place. You always have new audiences, and even though things are the same, they're always a little bit different, which is fun. You get to a new venue, you have new audiences, you have new acoustics, which always makes it interesting. But at the end of the day, the fun part is you get backstage and there's your set and there are your props, and you look around and there are your castmates, your friends, your family who you trust with this process, and that all stays the same. So as much as things change, you always feel like you're home in a way, and that's super fun. And it's such an interesting way of performing and getting to know people as friends and as performers.
So, and you use the word family also. So, Ronnie, do you feel that too? That there's this bonding in this particular group?
Absolutely. Not only are we a family, but our families become families as well.
Mhm.
Many times my family, my two daughters and my wife would come and visit, and we'd actually get together with Mark and his family. We'd go out to dinner, we'd go to a pool, or just, have this camaraderie to really explore and meet people who are super talented, super interesting, and just really just fine human beings.
Yeah.
And
So,
if I
Mark,
could piggyback on that also,
yeah.
something that's really fun, and Ronnie will especially appreciate this, is because there's so many of us. Luckily, I have my family with me, but so many people on the road don't have their families with them, which you get a little homesick, a little heartsick, and something that we have established. I'm pretty sure, if I'm not mistaken, that Ronnie took the lead on this. As a matter of fact, is that usually 2 times a month, so every other week on Friday nights we have after the show a cast Shabbat, and it's a potluck. We go to someone's place, whoever has the most space at whatever place they are staying at in any given city, and people cook and they bring wine, and we sing the prayers, we do the blessings, and we just have a Shabbat, and we really connect with each other on that family level, and we get to sample some of the best hummus I've ever eaten, compliments of Ronnie Malley himself. So life is good on every other Friday night.
Beautiful. The show itself, the themes of the show are so beautiful. And I think the things that you've been bringing up, the connections that you have with the other people in the cast, reflects the show in many ways. The show is, it's not one of these heavy-handed things that says people should just get along. That's not what it's about. It's about humanity and a sense of yearning. I've talked to some of the other artists about that there's something in that yearning for connection. Can you talk a little bit about the show, Marc?
Yeah, basically, it starts off right away with the question of what would we do as humans when somebody who we have been told is somebody we're not supposed to like and not supposed to get along with ends up in our kitchen, pretty much in our home, in our backyard, and they're struggling. They have no choice but to stay in this place for the night. Do we welcome them in, or do we kick them to the curb and say good luck in a place where there's no hotel? And it has that moment of humanity where we say, what would we do in this case? And in this case, humanity wins out, and it's really a beautiful moment. And from then on, there's no politics. There's no religious talk at all. It's basically just getting to know each other as human beings for one evening of our lives. And wouldn't that be lovely if we could all do that?
And how does the music play into it, Ronnie? You mentioned earlier that you were brought in as a consultant to give the flavor of that Middle East, an authentic flavor of the Middle Eastern music, and yet the music takes from that tradition, and it's a little jazz. There are various styles, and yet it all works together. How does it work together, and how does it reflect the themes that Marc talked about?
Well, I was part of the early iterations of this and presenting some of this to help shape it. But then they had the good sense in bringing one of the most talented composers on Broadway right now, David Yazbek, who's not only a composer, but a lyricist as well. And what's fascinating and beautiful is he's also got both Arab and Jewish roots,
Oh, I
which
didn't
is
know that.
crazy. And what's wonderful about that is he really did something that I spent a long time in my life as a teacher doing, is trying to teach people not to just generalize all Middle Eastern music or all this music or all these people. And he brought to what his background was from Middle Eastern tradition, really authentic instrumentation, musical scales, rhythms, but also brought in the whole American musical tradition as well, which he's very well versed in, which has a lot of jazz and whatnot. And he did an exceptional job, I thought, of fusing these two things together, putting the lyrics together too, working hand in hand with Itamar, who is the writer of the script.
Itamar Moses, right?
And they turned out to be an amazing dynamic duo, actually, together, writing both the words, the lyrics, and just, you know, this is kind of like it's a play about nothing. It really is. But what makes it something is that it's accessible to every human being who's ever had a relationship, who's ever been married, who's ever had awkwardness with a girl, who's ever been lost in a place, or who's ever found themselves a little bit socially isolated from something.
Yeah.
Qualities to this.
Such a beautiful show. I've seen it twice now, and I can't wait to see it when it comes to LA. And we'll talk about that again in a moment. But so, Marc, how did you get involved in the show?
In a very different way than most of the cast, actually. Most of the cast lives in and auditioned in New York, and many of them auditioned for the Broadway company before the tour, and they were trying to find places for everybody because the Broadway company was still going, and they were trying to mount the tour, so they were figuring out where people fit in. I don't live in New York, so what had happened was I had developed a relationship with the Tara Rubin casting office, and they thought that this would be, you know, a possible fit for me. So we got an audition notice from them, my agent and I, and they said, "Would you be interested in sending in a video?" And so I took my my phone, put it on a tripod, and did an audition for them. Read some scenes and sang some music. And on top of that, a lot of my character, what I do is speak in Hebrew.
So your character is Sammy, am I right?
I am Sammy. Yeah.
Yeah. So who is Sammy, and tell us about the Hebrew.
Sammy's a townie. He was born and raised there. There's not a lot of backstory given to him. So the way I look at him is that he was, you know, the big man on campus in high school and, you know, and probably beyond, and kind of stayed there. He never really grew up. He did get married and have a child, but he was still that guy who couldn't grow up, who had to cling to his hip clothes and seeing other women and what have you. And that has taken him in a bad spiral and just made him a pretty negative person in his life. That's the way I see him. But to put a spin on that, it's, you know, he's not a bad person. He's just someone who can't find his way, who got lost somewhere, who can't grow up, and did some regrettable things. But I wouldn't say he's the villain of the piece. He's just not forward thinking in that.
Yeah, there really are no villains.
No, not at all. Not at all. He's just a very complicated guy who never grew up, really. And on top of that, almost everything I do in the show is spoken in Hebrew. So I studied some in Hebrew school way back in the day, but I don't speak Hebrew. So for this audition, I went to a good family friend who is from Israel, and I said, "So here's what's on the page, and I don't want to speak it like I'm speaking Hebrew school Hebrew, because that's clearly not what would happen. So how can I do this? And maybe you could give me a couple. I can give you a couple ad libs that I want to do, and you can tell me how to say them in a colloquial, you know, maybe even slang way." And we worked really hard on it. I sent my audition in. I didn't hear anything for a couple weeks, maybe even a month. And then I got a call saying, "We'd like to fly you out to New York for a callback," which is an incredible compliment. So it worked out. I hopped on a plane. I got there on a Sunday night. I went in. I had an audition on Monday. I sang Sammy's little itty bitty piece about 8 or 9 times with our associate music director Jeff Tice, and after that, I did the scenes with in front of David Cromer, our incredible director, with a couple of our cast members, actually, Joe Joseph and Ahmed Maksoud, who read with me. And after I did the reading, David Cromer looked at me and said, "Do you speak Hebrew?" And I said, "No, I don't, but I'm so happy that I gave that impression." And that was it.
That's so funny. You know, the ironic thing is Ronnie does speak Hebrew very well.
Very well, very well.
So Ronnie, you play Kamel, yes, and so it's unusual because you came in as a musician, and yet they made you an actor. So had you done some acting before that?
I did. My piece that I wrote, the play I wrote, was Ziryab. I was actually an actor and solo performer of that. But prior to that, I did do regional theater too, where I was in the Knights cast that toured with Mary Zimmerman, and one of the actual original Broadway members, Jonathan Raviv, who I mentioned earlier. So we actually, that was the first time we'd met, was on tour for the Arabian Nights by Mary Zimmerman.
Wow.
I mean, I've been performing on stage since I was 10. I'm not going to call myself the full-fledged Juilliard actor, but I understand what it means to be in the character, how to develop a character. And I worked teaching theatrical things through schools, writing scripts or embodying character and working with students and whatnot. But that was the question actually that really brought me into the production is Dean Chernow is like, I'm trying to make this work. You know, they need to understand that we have, you know, niche musicians. It's not going to be this just, you know, you can get any musician from anywhere, and they need to, you know, understand that. And then he's like, hey, can you act?
By the way.
Yeah, he's like, well, let me set you up with an audition then with New York. And so I did. I went in, auditioned for Cromer. I sent in a video actually initially, and that's where I got the call back to come out. Yeah. So I said, all right, well, step one's done. And I went out and did the audition. They said, okay, now we got an actor who's also a musician, and that'll fill in those 2 spots for us.
Wow, beautiful.
You know, I don't know if you mentioned I was the Arabic dialect coach for the show.
Oh, yeah, let's talk about that for a moment. I'm curious about that because you grew up with the Palestinian dialect, and in the show, the Arabic is Egyptian. So how did you attune your ear to that?
Well, I didn't have to because the Egyptian dialect is like the lingua franca of the Middle East. So much so that because all of the movies and all of the films come out from Egypt, it's so much like that if you go to a place like Morocco or Tunisia or even Iraq, where a Levantine dialect is so foreign to them, we would all fall into speaking Egyptian dialect to understand each other.
I see, like the great American dialect that you hear on the news or whatever.
Exactly.
So exactly. Interesting. Well, I'm afraid we're running out of time. So I want to tell our folks at home again, the show will be coming to Los Angeles. The band's visit is going to be at the Dolby Theater, and we don't know when exactly, but hopefully in the next month or 2, things will start to take shape, and the tour will go back again to many, many cities. Do you know some of the cities that it might be going to in the near future?
No, there's speculation, but at this point, we're just given an idea of a couple back to work dates, and neither one of those panned out of obvious reasons. So we're kind of on the hook, waiting to see what's going on. But
I know the show's been to DC and Chicago and North Carolina, South Carolina, Philadelphia, Dallas, Houston, and was heading west. So hopefully it will land here very soon. Ronnie, would you please play us out with something? And I really want to thank you so much for participating. We could have talked, I'm sure, for many hours. I have so many more questions for you. So can I ask you to please come back and see us sometime?
That'd be wonderful. I'd love to do that.
Okay. And when you're in Los Angeles, folks, he will be coming to Valley of Shalom in one way or another. We'll get him there and get some of the other fine musicians from the cast to join us for some interesting music. Thanks, Ronnie, and thank you, Marc.
Of course.
Anecdote for Marc too. He said he spoke Hebrew, but he did actually also have to end up learning Arabic for the show too.
That's true.
Really?
That's just a quick before Ronnie plays us out. No, I was asked to be kind of a last minute understudy for one of the Egyptian band members, just as an emergency understudy, and they said, "Don't worry, you'll never go on in case something crazy happens." And something crazy happened, and I had to go on. And in I think it was 3 days, I had to put everything together and learn how to hold the clarinet properly and what have you. But luckily, we were in Louisville, Kentucky. I remember it well, and I just happened to be sharing a room, a dressing room with Ronnie in that specific city. So I asked him if he would come in early on a handful of nights, and he taught me the Arab dialect in a matter of days. So he is the master. So I was in good hands.
So give us a little Arabic.
كان المفروض يكونوا هنا 11 ونص.
Okay. You made Ronnie laugh. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Desde a mi amor si me bien quiere, que traiga la mula y que me lleve. Desde a mi amor si me bien quiere, que traiga la mula y que me lleve. Más por las arenicas y por las arenas, por talla no vea y venga a buscar. Por las arenicas y por las arenas, por talla no vea y venga a buscar. Ia hija, ia hija, ia hija, ia hija. Elilo, eleli, elilo, adeli, eli. عيدي سيد حبيبي فينا هو الوردة والوردة والوردة بشوكة عيدي عيدي سيد حبيبي فينا هو حبيبي هو سيد حبيبي هو غزالي ماله نساني عيدي عيدي سيد حبيبي فينا هو حبيبي هو سيد حبيبي هو سيد انت لساني عيدي عيدي سيد حبيبي فينا هو عيدي عيدي سيد حبيبي فينا هو عيدي عيدي سيد حبيبي فينا هو